Amman, April 1996. He had not slept at a known address in 6 years. 2 capitals held photographs of him from a decade earlier, and no photograph of him from the last 1,000 days. The peace treaty with Jordan was 18 months old. The political bureau in Shmeisani was open, and inside it, the paperwork he ran was the paperwork of every Iranian rifle that reached Gaza through Damascus. But his daughter was in labor across the city, and a man who has buried 2 sons does not miss the first hour of his first grandson's life. This is Operation Confinement, and this is how Mossad ran a watch on a labor ward. Welcome to Operation Insights with Daniel. If the tradecraft is why you subscribe, this one is built out of nothing else. Stay a while. Amman in 1996 was a city that had learned to hold its foreign guests without asking too many questions about their sleeping arrangements. The peace treaty with Israel was called Wadi Araba, signed in October 1994 and ratified in November of the same year, and it had opened 2 new border crossings, one at Aqaba in the south, one at the Jordan River Bridge in the north, and one new political silence. King Hussein was on the throne. Prince Hassan was the heir apparent. The General Intelligence Directorate, known inside the country as the Mukhabarat, ran a professional counter-espionage service out of a compound at Wadi Asir, and it kept a specific desk on the political bureau of Hamas that had been operating openly in the capital since 1991. The bureau was in Shmeisani, on the broad boulevards of the northwest. Its public face was a fluent man in his early 40s named Khaled Meshaal. Its private face, in April 1996, was a much older man who has never been photographed and whose name was Ashraf Nasser al-Din al-Halabi. Al-Halabi was 54. He had been born in Nablus and had married once, to a woman who had died in 1988 and had fathered 3 children. 2 of them, both sons, were dead. The elder had been killed in Gaza in 1989 at 19 years of age. The younger had been killed in southern Lebanon in 1992 at 18. Colleagues in the bureau addressed him by his kunya, Abu Musab, the father of Musab, though there had been no living Musab in his household for 4 years. That was the shape of the man on the outside. The inside was a paperwork chain. His formal role, inside the military wing known as the Izz al-Din al-Qassam Brigades, was weapons procurement and cross-border logistics on the Amman-Damascus-Tehran coordination leg. The open-source consensus in the region by then was already firm. Since the early 1990s, Iran had been the principal financial and material sponsor of the military wing, routing weapons and components through third countries, Sudan out of Khartoum, Syria through Damascus, later Egypt across Sinai into Gaza. In April 1996, the Damascus Channel was the mature one. The Sudan to Sinai overland route was in its formative years. Amman, because the bureau was physically there and because 2 of the 3 services concerned with the paperwork also kept people in Amman, was a natural coordinating point for men who moved between capitals. Al-Halabi did the moving between capitals. He had done it without a photograph for 1,000 days. The one thing everybody who lived inside the paperwork knew about him was that he had 3 sleeping addresses in 3 quarters and no 4th. There was a small back apartment behind a fabric wholesaler in Al-Waidat, the Palestinian refugee camp neighborhood in the east of the city. There was a room over a print shop in Suela, in the north. There was a guest room at a private residence in Zarqa, the industrial city 30 kilometers northeast of Amman. He rotated between them by a system nobody in the bureau understood, and no service in the region had mapped. His only unbreakable habit was a telephone call from a specific public call box in the Al-Muhajirin quarter to his elderly mother every second Friday at a fixed minute. He had made the call for 6 years. The Mukhabarat had known about the call box for 2. In December 1995, a research division analyst at Mossad headquarters at Glilot, north of Tel Aviv, closed the movement file on al-Halabi and opened a new one on his family. Her codename inside the operation would be Puffin, Her name was Tal Zohar, and she was 34 years old, 6 years into the desk, and had spent the previous 18 months trying to reconstruct al-Halabi's week from what the three services physically at his disposal had physically failed to see. The three services had built a movement map that was blank in the middle. She had built one that was blank at the edges, too. In late November, she gave up on the man and went to see her section head with a single-page memorandum and a photograph she had bought from a stringer in Amman. The memorandum said, in 96 words, that al-Halabi had 3 sleeping addresses and 1 grandchild coming. The photograph was of the daughter, Rawan al-Halabi, 27, translator by training out of the Faculty of Foreign Languages at the University of Jordan, married since 1994 to a Palestinian-Jordanian architect named Jamal Odeh, who worked at a small West Amman practice. Rawan was 6 months pregnant. She had done nothing operational in her life and would do nothing operational for the rest of it. The point of the photograph was that she was the only fixed person the target loved and could not stop loving. Zohar's doctrine was old. In a patriarchal, family-anchored society, when a target has gone to ground and his own movement is unreadable, productive surveillance moves to those he cannot fully control, in descending order: children, especially unmarried daughters still at home, spouses, aging parents, siblings. The target himself becomes an outcome of the family surveillance rather than its object. The doctrine had been in the case officer literature for 2 generations and had never been unfashionable. What Zohar added, in the last paragraph of the memorandum, was that Rawan al-Halabi had chosen an antenatal clinic in West Amman in the 2nd week of November, and that the clinic had a name, an address, and a monthly cycle of scheduled appointments. The section head read the memorandum twice. He asked one question. He asked what the doctor's name was. Zohar told him. Dr. Salim Karadsheh, senior obstetrician at Al-Nada Maternity Center, on a side street off the 3rd Circle, in the Jabal Amman side of the Zaran district. Zohar had already checked the register. Al-Halabi's daughter's first appointment had been logged in the admissions book by a night porter in blue ink at 4:11 on a Wednesday afternoon. That was the phrase the section head carried out of the room with him. 4:11 on a Wednesday afternoon. The clinic sat in a narrow street of stone-clad villas that stepped down from the 3rd Circle towards Jabal Amman. Its type was the standard West Amman private maternity clinic of the mid-1990s, a converted 1970s villa expanded with a small clinical wing in the following decade, 3 stories, a paved forecourt with an olive tree and a stone bench, a metal side door for staff and services, a service corridor that ran the length of the ground floor from the pharmacy to the linen room. Its class was the class of the real Akala Maternity Hospital, opened in Amman in 1960 and moved to the 3rd Circle in 1966, and a Farah Maternity Hospital across the city. Al-Nada ran 1 delivery suite, a small recovery room, a single ground floor operating theater for emergencies, 6 2-bed wards on the 2nd floor, a small nursery behind glass at the corridor turn, and a 1st floor east-west corridor with a picture window at its eastern end, looking down onto the forecourt. Rawan al-Halabi had chosen it on the recommendation of a college friend from the University of Jordan, whose own daughter had been delivered there in 1993. She had walked past it a dozen times in the previous year without noticing it. The choice had been made in an ordinary sentence at an ordinary lunch in Wasfi, in the west of the city, where the shopping streets were and where 2 women could meet without anybody paying attention to what they said. That the choice was ordinary was the whole point. The clinic had been chosen for the reasons any first-time mother in West Amman in 1996 would have chosen it. Nobody had steered it. Nobody would have had to. Rawan's antenatal appointments settled into a fortnightly cycle. She arrived by service on the last stretch from the 2nd Circle, rather than by taxi, because the service dropped her closer and because she liked the walk uphill. Her husband, Jamal Odeh, met her at the clinic on the days his practice's site work allowed him to. Her mother-in-law came on days he could not. She was seen at every appointment by Dr. Karadsheh, and from her 16th week visit onwards, by a private lactation nurse the clinic recommended. The nurse's name was Rania Halawa, a Christian-Jordanian widow in her mid-30s, from the small stone town of Fuhais to the west of the capital. Halawa was said to be the widow of a Royal Jordanian engineer killed in a road accident in 1992, though nobody at the clinic had ever asked to see the paperwork. She held a Jordanian midwifery certificate and worked out of 2 West Amman clinics on a private nurse contract. She was, in the fabric of the antenatal wing, exactly what she said she was. She was not what she said she was. On the 25th of February 1996, a suicide bomber killed 26 people on the number 18 bus route in Jerusalem in the morning rush hour, on a stretch of Jaffa Road that carried the city's early commuters onto their working week. 17 of the dead were Israeli civilians. 9 were Israeli soldiers on their way back to base after the weekend. Hamas claimed the attack the same day. A week later, on the 3rd of March, a second bomber killed 19 more on the same bus route in the same city, in almost the same hour, 3 streets further west on the same road. On the 4th of March, the day after that, a third bomber killed 13 people at the entrance of the Dizengoff Center in Tel Aviv in the early afternoon, on a Monday of a school half-term when the shopping arcade had been full of children. A fourth attack, at the Ashkelon soldier crossing, added to a total that closed the fortnight at approximately 59 dead across the 4 bombings. All 4 were the work of the Izz al-Din al-Qassam brigades under the operational direction of Mohammed Deif in Gaza. In Jerusalem, the caretaker Peres government, Shimon Peres had been acting prime minister since Yitzhak Rabin's assassination in November 1995, signed a written authorization that had been sitting in a Caesarea safe for 3 months. The election was scheduled for the 29th of May. Benjamin Netanyahu would win it by roughly 30,000 votes. Nobody in the government yet knew what the margin would be, but the polls had begun to move within 24 hours of the first Jerusalem bus. The authorization Peres signed did not name Ashraf Nasr al-Din al-Halabi. It named a category of targets and a doctrine, family anchored close, in a friendly capital, on a paperwork chain rather than a public actor, and it granted the Caesarea desk a working budget and a 5-month window. Amichai Doron, 41, the case officer who had been carrying the al-Halabi file since March 1994, was called back from London 2 days after the Dizengoff bombing. He read the authorization once, in a room in Herzliya, with the window closed and the electric fan running against the noise of the outer corridor. He read it a second time with his desk lamp turned to the wall so that the paper was in half shadow, in the professional habit of a man who did not like the way a signed line looked in a bright light. He asked for one addition to the paperwork before he signed. He asked for a written line that no chemical close would be used on Jordanian soil, no ballistic close would be used on Jordanian soil, and no third country passport carried by any member of the team would ever be presented at any check-in inside Amman, except at the airport under a clean legend. The addition was granted. Doron signed the authorization with his real name, in his real hand, at 14:06 on the 6th of March. His code name inside the operation was Winchat. He would not sleep in his own bed for 11 of the next 42 nights. Nira Almog had been in Amman since the last week of November 1995. She was 38, born on a kibbutz in the north, and had been carrying private nursing legends for the Caesarea desk since 1989. Her code name was Bluethroat. Her Amman cover identity was Rania Halawa. The legend had been built by the document unit at Glilot across 5 months in 1995, and it had 4 things in it that a legend needed and 1 thing it did not. The 4 things were a real Jordanian passport in the cover name, issued by the correct Amman office in the correct week of the correct year, a genuine Jordanian midwifery certificate under the cover name, cross-reference to the private nursing school where a witting Sayan had lodged a real personnel file 2 years earlier, a signed reference from a real West Amman consultant obstetrician, obtained through the same Sayan without the obstetrician's knowledge, and a rented flat in Jabal al-Wabdeh, the older mixed Christian-Muslim quarter on the hill facing downtown, with a landlord's contract, a paid quarterly electricity bill, and a jasmine plant on the balcony. The thing the legend did not have was a mother in Fuhais. Halawa was said to have been the last of her line. There was nobody to phone if anybody wanted to check. Almog placed herself into Rawan al-Halabi's antenatal circle by 3 moves. She took a private nurse consulting contract at Al-Nada in November 1995, 3 weeks before Rawan booked her first appointment. She took a second contract at a smaller West Amman clinic in Shmeisani, so that her name appeared in 2 ledgers and her availability appeared thin. She refused 2 new mother contracts in the same month for reasons that had nothing to do with either of the clinics and everything to do with looking like a woman who did not need the money. When Dr. Karadshe asked her in the second week of December if she could add 1 client for a first pregnancy on his ward, she said she would consider it and left it a day. She said yes on the phone the following morning at 9:50 from her flat in Jabal al-Wabdeh, standing at the sink with the tap running because a tap running is a habit of a woman who is not being listened to. By the 12th of January, 1996, she was into the family. Rawan liked her. Jamal O'Day, who was a shy man who preferred the presence of a professional to the presence of a friend, liked her more. Al-Halabi's sister Layla, who came to the flat on Rainbow Street twice a week to make sure her niece was eating, liked her most of all. In an antenatal home visit on the 10th of February, a Saturday morning, an appointment Almog had made because Rawan had complained of an ache in her lower back on the Wednesday. Almog spent 40 minutes at the flat with Rawan and the aunt, drinking cardamom coffee from the pot Layla had brought that week from her mother's kitchen in Al-Muhajirin. Layla was the aunt of a niece by a brother she had not seen face to face for 11 months. She was also the only woman in the world who telephoned the target's mother in Al-Muhajirin more than once a week. Almog understood, sitting at the kitchen table on that Saturday morning, that the aunt was the second door into the family, and that the aunt did not know she was a door. By the beginning of February, Almog had a picture in her head of the daughter's week that would not have fitted into any file. She had the doctor's name. She had the antenatal appointments through to the expected date of delivery. She had the flat, the aunt, the mother-in-law, the 2 friends who came at weekends, and the 2 neighbors who came on Wednesdays. She had a list of the 8 people the daughter would call from the hospital before the birth, in the order she would call them. What she did not have was the target. Nobody had the target. That was the point of the doctrine. The target was going to come to her. Yosef Barnea's code name was Stonechat. He was 44, an access officer at Caesarea by trade, and he had done his previous 8 operations across 5 countries without ever letting his real face touch a working camera. His Amman legend was Sharif Odeh, a Palestinian-Jordanian medical gas engineer working under a real Jordanian trade license held by a firm called Kevorkian Medical Supplies, whose warehouse sat in the Al-Muhajirin quarter, east of Al-Nahda Maternity Center. The firm was real. Its proprietor was a Whitting scion, Aram Kevorkian, 62, an Armenian Jordanian whose father had come to Amman in 1938 and whose loyalty to the Jewish state was a private matter of grandparents in Aleppo. He preferred not to name aloud. Kevorkian did not know what Barnea's operation was and had not asked. He knew only that his warehouse would issue 1 clean set of paperwork for 1 contract engineer with an unfamiliar face, and that the invoicing would clear on the 1st of every month. The medical gas access at a private maternity clinic in West Amman in 1996 was the cleanest available access. The clinic held cylinder cages of oxygen and nitrous oxide on its outside wall by the pharmacy. The regulators inside, corridor manifolds, wall plate outlets, and the delivery suites were on a monthly inspection cycle. The cycle was contracted out. The engineer who arrived to check them wore blue coveralls, carried a metal case, and worked alone. He walked in through the metal side door and out through the metal side door. The clinical staff were not asked to accompany him. He was expected to sign the pharmacy docket on the way out and to leave a copy of the docket for the accountant. Barnea began his monthly inspection routine at Al-Nada on Wednesday, the 10th of January 1996, at 1940 hours. He did the inspection properly. He replaced a corroded regulator on a wall plate outlet in the delivery suite in his second visit. He identified and had Kevorkian's warehouse deliver a replacement pressure gauge in his third. By the end of February, he had walked the ground floor and the first floor of the clinic on 4 separate nights and had been seen by the night shift senior nurse, Amira Faroon, on 3 of them. She had waved him through on the third without asking to see his identification card. That was the badge he had needed to earn. It was a badge nobody could have written for him. His briefing at Herzliya on the day of Paris's authorization added 1 line to the routine. The engineer would perform his April inspection on the night Rawan al-Halabi was admitted to Al-Nada in labor. He would perform it whether that night was a Wednesday or not. The cover story for the change was already prepared. The pharmacy had a wall plate outlet with a slow leak that Kevorkian's paperwork would have flagged for a follow-up call. Faroon would take 1 phone call about it 4 hours before she came on shift. The paperwork would be waiting for her when she arrived. The engineer would arrive between 2200 and 2300 hours, would sign in at the pharmacy, and would remain on the premises for as long as the leak took to be safely closed off. Nobody would need to ask him to leave, and nobody would. Sarat Ben-Ari's code name was Twite. She was 29. She had leased a small first-floor flat on Rainbow Street, the eastern reach of Jabal Amman that ran downhill towards the First Circle, on the 14th of January 1996. Her cover identity was Clara Chahine, a Lebanese-Jordanian doctoral student in art history at the University of Jordan, 6 months into a thesis on the mosaics of Madaba. The flat's front window looked directly across the street at the balcony of Rawan and Jamal Odeh's apartment on the 3rd floor of a stone-clad walk-up. The flat's back window looked down into a residential lane that fed both ways onto the through street. Ben-Ari would not leave the flat for the operational month, except to buy vegetables and to visit the university library twice a week. She would spend her nights sitting in the back room with the desk lamp on, marking undergraduate essays, and she would spend her days sitting in the front room with a book open on her lap, watching a balcony. The observation post was one part of a triangle. The other 2 parts were a call box at a corner of Al-Muhajirin, from which al-Halabi still made his second Friday call to his mother, and a rented safe flat in Swayfi, 10 minutes drive from Al-Nada, that would be used only on the operational night. Ben-Ari's job through February and March was not to catch a target. It was to hold a picture of a household in a mid-pregnancy month, which lights were on at what hour, which car parked where, which visitor came which afternoon, which pharmacy the husband walked to for the antenatal iron tablets, and how long he stayed inside. She logged the picture in a shorthand of her own onto page after page of a notebook that would leave the country in her handbag by way of Queen Alia Airport in the last week of April on a Frankfurt flight she had booked at the university's expense. She saw al-Halabi for the first time on the 17th of February. He walked up the street from the direction of the First Circle, hatless, in a dark coat, at 21:04 in the evening, and he entered the building by the front door. He was inside for 1 hour and 41 minutes. He came out at 22:45 and walked back down the way he had come. Ben-Ari did not photograph him. Photographing him was against the paperwork. The file did not want a photograph. It wanted a movement pattern. He came back 3 more times before the middle of March. Each visit began between 20 and 2200 hours and ended by midnight. Each visit followed a telephone call from Rawan al-Halabi to her father's al-Waydat contact number that had itself followed a telephone call from Dr. Karadsheh to Rawan at Al-Nada between 4 and 5 in the afternoon. On the 4th of March 1996, the day of the Dizengoff bombing in Tel Aviv, the day Peres had signed the paperwork the previous evening in Israel, the day Doron had read it in Herzliya the following morning, al-Halabi made a decision his own paperwork chain never quite recovered from. He went to see his mother. He went in the evening, out of turn, and he stayed 2 nights. Mossad, his mother, was 79 that spring and lived in a small house in Al-Muhajirin with an unmarried younger sister who was her primary carer. The house had 2 rooms and a courtyard. The courtyard held a lemon tree and a plastic garden chair the mother could no longer walk to. Al-Halabi arrived at 10:40 in the evening and left at 9:02 on the morning of the 6th. He did not use the call box on either day. He did not leave the house except to sit for 20 minutes on the third afternoon in the courtyard with his mother, who could no longer walk. He carried her from the second room to the plastic chair in his arms, sat down opposite her on the tiles, and held one of her hands in both of his for the 20 minutes and did not speak. The mother said his kunya twice, and once said the name of his elder dead son, and then stopped speaking. Ben-Ari's static post on Rainbow Street did not see him. The listening post on the call box did not hear him. He was, for those 2 nights, the ghost the paperwork chain had been built to catch. The case officer team had planned for exactly this contingency, and had planned for it in the negative. The observation window on the mother's house widened by 2 nights, from the standing 8 hours of the second Friday listening watch to a 2-night geographical fix on a specific ground floor room in a specific quarter. The team elected not to move. The paperwork ordered a family-anchored close at the daughter, on the daughter's calendar, in the daughter's clinic. It did not order an ambush at the mother's block. Doron held the line in a phone call from Herzliya to a public call box in Wasfi that Ben-Ari answered from a payphone at the university library at 3:12 in the afternoon of the 5th. He had used the call box for 2 years for other files. He had used the payphone at the library for 4 months for this one. The whole conversation lasted 48 seconds and ended with Doron saying, in the language of the paperwork, the one line the whole operation would depend on: "We don't fire the ghost's gun for him." Ben-Ari put the receiver down and walked back to her flat in the afternoon rain, which had begun on the plateau above the 5th circle at 2:40 and would clear by 4. The correctness of that decision would be the sub-argument of the after-action report 6 months later. It was a decision to leave a hard-earned geographical fix on the table because the doctrine said not to spend it. Every case officer in the room knew, then and later, that a different desk on a different night would have made the other call. What kept the pattern intact was that Al-Halabi walked out of Al-Muhajirin at 9:02 on the morning of the 6th and disappeared back into his 3-address rotation, and Ben-Ari on Rainbow Street saw him twice more between then and the 7th of April. Rawan Al-Halabi went into labor on a Wednesday evening in the second half of April 1996 in the flat on Rainbow Street at 7:50. Her mother-in-law was with her. Her husband was at his practice's Wasfi office finishing a site drawing. She telephoned him at 7:53. She telephoned Dr. Karadche at 7:56. She telephoned her Aunt Layla at 8:02. The last call she made from the flat was to a number in Al-Wehdat at 8:08. She did not know that the Al-Wehdat number was answered by a man who was not her father, who took the message, hung up, and dialed a second number from memory. Between the moment she said the words, "The contractions are 8 minutes apart," into her own kitchen telephone, and the moment the second dialer said them into a public call box in Zarqa, was 49 minutes. Al-Halabi received the message in Zarqa at 8:57. Rawan was admitted to Al-Nada Maternity Center at 9:15. She was walked in through the front entrance by her mother-in-law and by Jamal O'Day, who had reached Rainbow Street at 8:22 and driven her up the hill in the practice's Toyota Corolla. The Corolla was a 1993 model in the pale silver color that half the practices in West Amman drove that year, on Amman white plates with black lettering, and it had been washed at the practice yard on the Monday. Dr. Karadche arrived by his own car at 9:28, a dark green Peugeot 505 saloon he had bought in Beirut on a family trip in 1992. Rawan was moved to the first-floor delivery suite at 10:06, walking on the arm of her mother-in-law and Nurse Faroon. The clock, from the moment the admissions register recorded her name in blue ink in the vestibule, was inside the 12 to 20 hour band of first child labor occupies in every private hospital textbook of the region. Bluethroat, standing at the pharmacy shutter window at 9:42 on the pretext of collecting a package Kevorkian had left for her the previous afternoon, had a picture of the ground floor corridor she had built up over 5 months and a copy of the maternity wing shift schedule she had photographed with a pocket camera in January. She said good evening to the pharmacy assistant, took the small paper bag, put it in her handbag, and walked back out through the front reception without ever raising her voice above the level of an ordinary Wednesday evening lactation nurse collecting a pack of nipple cream on her way home. Amichai Doron was in Herzliya. He had flown from Queen Aliyah to Larnaca on a European passport 6 days earlier, back to Tel Aviv on a domestic Cyprus-Israel connection, and had been at the case officer's desk since Sunday morning. He was on a landline throughout the night. Puffin, at the same desk, held the paper file at his elbow, updated in her own hand in blue ink every 15 minutes. She wrote each entry to a set line, spacing that had begun as a habit and had become, by the 4th month of the file, a small private discipline. She believed, without ever saying so aloud, that a hand that stayed steady on a page kept a corridor steadier 600 kilometers away. Riedling, the exfiltration driver Ehud Saker, was at the wheel of a rented saloon in a lay-by west of the Sheikh Hussein, Jordan River Bridge, listening to Jordan Radio 96.3, waiting for a specific hour on his own watch that would tell him to start the engine and begin the drive from the North Crossing to a specific holding point on the Israeli side. He had been at the lay-by since Sunday afternoon and had drunk the last of his flask coffee at 8 in the evening. Barnea, in the pharmacy corridor of Al-Nada, was checking the wall plate outlet Kevorkian's paperwork had flagged, in blue coveralls and a plastic identification card. He had signed the shift log at 22:49. Al-Halabi, at that moment, was in the back of a Peugeot 505 heading south from Zarqa on the Amman Road. The Peugeot was a 1988 model in a dark red the paintwork had faded from. The driver was a man named Ihab Nashashibi, the Amman fixer who had picked Al-Halabi up at the private residence in Zarqa 18 minutes earlier and would drop him at the top of the hill on Rainbow Street. The distance was 30 kilometers. The time on Al-Halabi's own watch was 9:20. He would reach the flat on Rainbow Street at 10:42. The waiting area at Al-Nada in 1996 was a rectangular vestibule off the ground floor reception, with a set of double glass doors onto the paved forecourt and a straight corridor running eastward past the pharmacy shutter window to the foot of the interior stairs. There were 9 chairs in the vestibule, arranged around 3 low tables. There was a floor-standing brass ashtray by the double doors, though nobody smoked in the hospital by then, and there was a wall-mounted rotary telephone by the reception counter that was used by staff for outgoing calls. The vestibule seated 15 at a squeeze. The night Rawan Al-Halabi was admitted, it seated 8 from her side alone. Al-Halabi arrived at 10:42, walked through the double glass doors without looking at the receptionist, and was greeted by his son-in-law with an embrace and a cup of tea. He did not go to the counter. He did not sign the visitor's register. He sat in the 3rd chair on the eastern wall, the one nearest the corridor, and he put his hat on the low table in front of him and did not take it up again. Layla Al-Halabi was at his right, holding the hand of Rawan's mother-in-law. The mother-in-law's brother, an olive oil trader from a village near Salt, who had driven in as soon as he was called, sat opposite. 2 friends of Rawan's from the University of Jordan sat by the door. Jamal Odeh moved between the counter and the corridor and the chair beside his father-in-law, in a pattern that had already, by 11:03, become a routine. The pattern was the operational geometry. Dr. Karadshe came down twice in the first 2 hours to speak to the son-in-law and the aunt. Nurse Faroon came down 4 times, once to fetch a bottle of drinking water for the labor bed, twice to make routine outbound calls from the reception telephone, once to hand a set of car keys to Jamal Odeh. Bluethroat, at the pharmacy shutter window at 11:14, spent 40 seconds handing across a package and 80 seconds asking after the antenatal instrument set she had left with the pharmacy that afternoon. She said good evening to the target as she passed his chair on the way out, in the professional voice of a nurse she had made him accustomed to hearing at the flat. The target and the son-in-law would not enter the delivery suite. Jordanian private maternity practice in 1996 admitted the husband and the mother-in-law to the antenatal and recovery areas, but the delivery suite itself was strictly clinical. That was the second half of the geometry. The father-in-law would sit in the vestibule with his back to the pharmacy shutter window and his line of sight through the double glass doors onto the paved forecourt. He would sit like that for the length of a first labor. He would not stand for more than 3 minutes at a stretch. He would not walk east down the corridor towards the interior stairs. He would not need to. The nurses would bring him news. The son-in-law would bring him news. The aunt would sit at his right and hold his hand. He would wait for his grandson. At 23:02, Jamal O'Day brought him a second cup of tea from the vestibule trolley and sat down on the arm of the chair beside him and said, in Arabic and in his ordinary voice, that his wife was doing well. Al-Halabi nodded once and put his hand briefly on his son-in-law's forearm. It was the closest a public gesture came, on either side of the family, to the private word neither man had ever used with the other. At 3:52 on the morning of the Thursday, Nurse Faroon's shift-change tea was poured in the small, windowless room off the pharmacy corridor. The tea was poured at 3:50 on every night shift in the wing. The 2 nurses coming off duty joined the 2 coming on for 4 minutes at the table, and the corridor between the pharmacy and the foot of the interior stairs held nobody at all for the length of the pour. The east-west corridor above them, on the first floor, was empty for the length of it, too. This was the 92nd window. Puffin had identified it in November 1995 from a 2-week Sunday through Saturday observation card kept by Bluethroat in her purse. Rawan al-Halabi's grandson was born at 3:49 in the delivery suite after 8 hours and 34 minutes of active labor. Dr. Karadshe clamped the cord at 3:50. The delivery suite door opened and closed twice in the following 2 minutes as the doctor walked out to speak to the father and returned. At 3:52, the corridor above went briefly silent. Ashraf Nasser al-Din al-Halabi, at that moment, was walking east along the vestibule and up the interior stairs toward the first-floor corridor and the picture window at its eastern end, because the son-in-law had come down and told him that a boy had been born and that he could stand at the window and see the nursery through the glass of the delivery wing turn. The mother-in-law was in the recovery room with her daughter. The aunt was in the vestibule with the friends. The son-in-law was walking up the stairs 3 steps behind his father-in-law and holding his mobile telephone in his hand, because he wanted to call his own mother in Salt. He would remember later that he had stopped on the second-floor landing because the reception on the mobile telephone had cut out. He would remember, more clearly, that he had heard his father-in-law's footsteps continue along the corridor above him. He would remember nothing else about the second half of that minute. Barnea reached the corner of the picture window from the pharmacy corridor by the service side. He was in blue coveralls. He carried the metal case. He was signed into the shift log. His identification card was on a lanyard at his neck. The pharmacy docket for the wall plate leak was in his breast pocket, unsigned, waiting for Faroon's tea to end. He walked 12 paces along the corridor, past the shuttered nursery glass, and stopped 1 pace behind the target at the eastern picture window. The picture window looked down onto the paved forecourt below and, beyond it, onto the sloping street of stone-clad villas stepping downhill towards the first circle. A single street lamp burned yellow above the olive tree at the forecourt gate. Al-Halabi was looking out. His right hand was in his coat pocket, where the silver worry beads his own father had bought in a jeweler's shop in the old Nablus market in 1956 sat around his forefinger. He had carried them, without a single day's interruption, for 40 years. His back was to the corridor. He heard Barnea's footsteps only in the last 2 paces. The close was manual. There was no ballistic report. There was no chemical residue. There was no scream. There was no shout. The corridor stayed silent for the remainder of the 92nd window. Barnea took a single half step to lower the target's body onto the corridor floor beneath the picture window, so that the son-in-law, when he reached the top of the stairs 17 seconds later, would see his father-in-law lying on his side under the window in the attitude of a man who had sat down suddenly against a wall. Barnea walked back along the corridor, past the shuttered nursery glass and down the pharmacy service stair, in the time it took the son-in-law to reach the corridor and stop. Nurse Faroon's tea was finished at 3:53, on schedule. Bluethroat left Al-Nada at 4:09 in the morning through the front reception, carrying a small handbag she had left at the pharmacy the previous afternoon, and speaking a soft goodnight to the night porter who was already back at his counter. Her taxi was waiting at the top of the street. It was a Mercedes 230 saloon in the standard Amman yellow livery, driven by an off-duty relative of a driver Kevorkian's warehouse, used for local deliveries. She was at her rented flat in Jabal al-Wabdeh by 4:41. She left the flat again at 5:04 on foot with a canvas suitcase and the same handbag, and was picked up by a second saloon at the top of the hill 3 minutes later. Stonechat left Al-Nada at 4:02 by the metal side door with the docket signed. He walked up the residential lane to the second observation post the team had rented for the night, a garage lockup behind a body repair shop off Zoran Street. He changed out of the blue coveralls into a pressed shirt and a dark jacket, put the coveralls and the metal case into a canvas bag, put the bag into the boot of the small saloon parked in the lockup, and drove west out of the Zahran district, past the 5th Circle at 4:36. Riedling picked up Bluethroat at the top of the Jabal al-Wabdeh hill at 5:07. He picked up Stonechat at the western edge of Swileh at 5:31. He drove the northwesterly out of the city, past the northern edge of Swileh at 5:34, and reached the queue for the Sheikh Hussein Bridge at 6:54. The crossing had opened for civilian traffic at 7. Riedling handed the officer on the Jordanian side 3 European passports at 7:03. The passports had been in the boot of his saloon for 3 weeks. Their entry stamps from Queen Aliyah matched the stamps in the boot. Their itineraries matched the itineraries in the boot. The Jordanian officer looked at each in the order Riedling handed them across, said nothing, and stamped the exit. He drove across the bridge and delivered his 2 passengers to a holding point on the Israeli side at 7:38, a small farmhouse with a courtyard the Caesarea desk had used 4 times in the previous 11 years, where a woman he did not know made coffee for the 3 of them in the kitchen before either of the arrivals was asked to speak a single word about the night. Amichai Doron flew out of Queen Aliyah Airport on a European passport at 11:45 in the morning on a scheduled flight to Frankfurt. He had been in his hotel room in Shmeisani since 3 in the morning, watching the analog clock on the wall and drinking tap water from a tall glass. He walked out of the hotel at 10:08, took a taxi to the airport, checked in at the counter, and cleared passport control without incident at 11:03. He carried nothing about the operation in his hand luggage. He carried in his shirt pocket a folded page of a spiral-bound notebook on which he had written nothing all night. He would burn it at his hotel in Frankfurt that evening, in a small metal wastebasket, with a match. Layla al-Halabi walked east along the first-floor corridor at 4:01 in the morning to fetch a cup of coffee from the vestibule tea trolley and to bring one back for her brother. She found him at 4:02, on his side, under the picture window at the eastern end of the corridor. She did not scream. She sat down on the floor beside him, put her hand on his shoulder and said his kunya once, out loud, into the empty corridor. She stayed sitting there for the minute and a half it took the son-in-law, on the landing below her, to reach the corridor. The private ambulance service Al-Nada used arrived at 4:11. Dr. Karadche had reached the corridor by 4:04, and he had been on the telephone from the reception counter since. The clinic's proprietor was called at 4:18. The General Intelligence Directorate's night desk at Wadi Asir was called at 4:32 by a man at the political bureau in Shmeisani, whom the son-in-law had reached from the second-floor landing telephone at 4:09. The Directorate's Palestinian Affairs section opened a file on the death at 5:01. The section head reached the clinic in a state car at 5:48. By 8 in the morning, the geography of who knew what had settled into 3 rings. The innermost ring, at the clinic and in the flat on Rainbow Street, knew that a man had died in a hospital corridor of what looked, at first sight and to a general practitioner's eye, like a sudden cardiac event in a man of 54 with a family history the household would not repeat aloud. The second ring, at the political bureau in Shmeisani, and at the Directorate's Palestinian Affairs section, knew that the man had not been ill and knew that a foreign hand had touched him. The third ring, at the palace and at the Prime Minister's office of Abdul Karim al-Khabariti. Al-Khabariti had taken office as Prime Minister on the 4th of March, 24 hours before Paris had signed his authorization, knew nothing at all until the middle of the afternoon, and even then not the whole shape of it. The Israeli press carried nothing traceable to the operation. The Jordanian press carried a 2-line obituary in the second edition of Al-Rai on the following day, giving the deceased's name and a spelling nobody in the bureau had used since 1989, and describing him as a resident of Amman. The bureau in Shmeisani observed a private 40 days. Rawan al-Halabi named the grandson Musa, after her paternal grandfather, on the morning of the 7th day, in the naming ceremony that Jordanian-Palestinian tradition places between the 6th and the 10th day of a newborn's life. The 7th day ceremony was small, held in the flat on Rainbow Street, attended by the aunt, the mother-in-law, and one neighbor from the floor below. Dr. Karadsha, who had signed the death certificate in his own hand at 4:51 on the morning of the labor, did not attend the naming. Rania Halawa did. She sat with the newborn in her arms for the length of the ceremony and handed him back to his mother when it was done. She would leave Amman 2 weeks later on the Frankfurt flight the university had booked for her doctoral colleague, Clara Chahine, on the same day. Rawan al-Halabi did not speak of her father, in public, for 11 years. The paperwork on family-anchored operations in a friendly capital was reissued at Caesarea in September 1996, with 2 new lines. The first line said that no team member on a family-anchored close would carry any third-country passport as an operational detail while on the ground in the operational capital. Passports would be presented at check-in on entry, at check-out on exit, and at no other point. The second line said that no close would be executed inside a hospital, a school, a place of worship, or the immediate residence of an elderly parent of the target on any operation ever. The second line was the one everyone in the room had wanted. The first line was the one nobody in the room had understood the importance of until the following September on Wasfi al-Tal Street in Amman, when 2 men on Canadian passports would fail to poison Khalid Meshaal, and the whole architecture of Israeli operations in the Hashemite kingdom would come apart. The election in Israel was held on the 29th of May, 1996, 7 weeks after the corridor at Al-Nada. Netanyahu won by roughly 30,000 votes. Peres was out of office by the middle of June. The al-Halabi paperwork chain into Amman coordination broke for 3 months and rebuilt itself around a lieutenant in Damascus named Rifat Salhab, who would run the desk from Damascus for the next 8 years and never once crossed the border into Jordan. 2 positions can be held about the corridor. The first is the position of the men and women who wrote the paperwork. Ashraf Nasser al-Din al-Halabi coordinated the paperwork of the rifles that reached the men who bombed the number 18 bus twice inside a fortnight, and killing him at a picture window at 3:52 in the morning of the day his grandson was born, was still killing him at a picture window at 3:52 in the morning of the day his grandson was born. The second is the position of the family, and of any state that has ever tried to draw a limit around a category of place. Even a man designated by an enemy retains a family, and the enemy's discipline about not touching a child does not extend to not staging his death yards from a nursery window. There is no third position. The paperwork rewritten in September 1996 drew the line where the case officer team, 6 months earlier, had not. The question the audience will be asked is which line they would have drawn. Comment below where you're watching from and where you land. Is a family milestone the one door a state should never open, or the one door only a state ever really gets to walk through? And if you think the paperwork rewritten in September 1996 should have been rewritten again, tell us why. If a briefing built out of nothing but tradecraft is the kind you want more of, subscribe and share this one wherever a story like it belongs.